cool breeze flowed through the leaves, accompanied by the gentle warmth of the sun. Flowers bloomed in various colors, and the trees, which had appeared practically lifeless due to the harsh winter, had now grown lush and green. In addition, many creatures were also in motion, from the birds that chirped their tunes to the bees that buzzed about. For many, this was certainly a time to be out and enjoy such a beautiful and lively atmosphere. And a certain 9-year-old girl and a young man, whom she met through rather unusual circumstances at a particular gallery, didn't want to miss out on this opportunity. Garry had been so busy with his studies and working a few extra hours at his job that he hadn't been able to babysit or visit Ib for the past few weeks. Needless to say, he was relieved to leave such stress behind for the day and spend the Friday afternoon at the park with his young friend once the school day was over. Ib and Garry spent most of the time strolling along the sidewalk and taking in the surrounding scenery until they eventually came across the playground. Garry had thought that Ib wanted to play with the other kids. However, she turned down the idea. It wasn't that she disliked playing, but the rambunctious and frenzied energy of the children was overwhelming, so they instead opted to rest on one of the nearby benches. Once the two sat down, Ib reached into her backpack and pulled out a storybook and, surprisingly, a plush rabbit. Ib said that her name was Mirabella, and it was relatively small compared to the other plushies Garry had seen in the past. And this one, in particular, sported a light pink dress that made it stand out. Ib explained that she had brought Mirabella along because the rabbit had insisted on joining them. While Garry found her claim a bit humorous, he was willing to play along if it meant making her happy. As Ib opened the first page of the illustrated book, she glanced up at Garry and requested that he read it to them. It wasn't the first time he'd read to her, so he was more than glad to do so, as he genuinely enjoyed reading these little tales.
But Flopsy, Mopsy, and Cottontail had bread and milk and blackberries for supper,
Garry said as he closed the book and chuckled.
I think I did a fine job with my narration, wouldn't you agree?
Ib nodded and smiled at him. He then looked down at the stuffed rabbit sitting beside her.
And did Mirabella like it too?
He asked, gently patting the stuffed bunny.
Yeah,
Ib said with a hint of laughter.
Good.
He said happily.
My, I'm feeling thirsty after all that walking around from earlier, aren't you?
Ib's muffled, prompted Garry to scan the area.
Pretty sure I saw a vending machine around here,
he said as he continued looking before he noticed it a bit off in the distance.
Ah, there it is,
He said, pointing to it.
You want to wait here?
He asked.
sure.
She replied.
Okay, want any soda or just water?
Water's fine.
All right, just stay right there, okay? I'll be back in a bit.
She gave him an affirmative nod and smiled as he walked away. Ib turned her attention to the pond a few feet away from her while she waited for him to return, watching the ducks swimming in it, observing them as they occasionally flapped their wings or dived into the water. Her focus slightly adjusted to the ground when she noticed a vivid green frog speeding over the pavement. Ib had never seen one so close. The little creature's bright color held her interest while it hopped around on the sidewalk. Her gaze followed it till it veered off the concrete and into the grass. She couldn't resist rising to see where it was going. When she got too close, it dashed to the pond's edge and disappeared into the water. She felt somewhat let down to see the little guy leave in a hurry, but at least she had something to tell Garry when he returned. As she turned around to head back to the bench, she suddenly felt her heart skip a beat, now seeing the spot where she and her stuffed friend sat wholly vacant. Panicked, Ib rushed over to it and tried looking under the seat. No luck. She was positive that her plushie had been placed there. She made an effort to search among some of the adjacent trees, but came up empty-handed.
Where could you have gone?
She thought, her worry intensifying gradually. Shifting her focus to the children still running around in the distance, perhaps it wouldn't hurt to head over to the play area to do a little investigating. It wasn't as if she would be straying too far, and she knew Garry would undoubtedly have a panic attack if she weren't in sight. She just had to look, and she wasn't going to let some brat take something that didn't belong to them. Glancing over, Garry seemed to still be casually standing there, waiting for other people to grab their beverages. With that, She made her way over to the playground. As she began her search, she first focused on the jungle gym, where most children flocked. She watched carefully as the youngsters raced their way across it, some climbing across the monkey bars by grasping them one at a time, to those that scaled the rock-climbing wall and descended from the slide. After a few minutes of careful observation, she realized that none of these kids had what she was looking for. With only the swing set and sandbox left to check, she looked around once more. However, the results remained the same. Apart from 2 kids swinging back and forth on the swing set and a toddler playing with their mother in the sandbox, there was no sign of Mirabella anywhere. With a sigh and her head hanging low, she reluctantly turned back to the bench. Her only option now was to wait for Garry's help. She only hoped whoever took her plush toy was still nearby and hadn't run off with it. Just as she was about to sit back down, she caught a glimpse of a much taller figure in the distance, obscured by the trees, with something white dangling from their hand. Not a second later, Ib sprinted at the sight, and as she drew nearer, the unmistakable shape of her stuffed animal came into view.
Wait!
She shouted. The young man stopped in his tracks at the sound of her voice and turned to face her. Once Ib made it towards him, she was panting heavily, but seeing Mirabella in sight brought her relief.
What do you want?
He asked, irritated. Looking up at him, Ib suddenly found herself unable to speak. The teen appeared anything but friendly. From his ripped and ragged attire to the slight scowl he gave her was enough for her to realize that this probably wasn't going to go as well as she had hoped. All she could do now was look for words that wouldn't irritate him any further.
Well, what is it?
He asked once more.
That bunny is mine.
She stuttered. He glanced down at the doll and scoffed.
This is yours? You still play with the Whittle bunny dolls?
He said, sneering at Ib. Ib looked down at her feet in an attempt to hide her reddened cheeks. Although this wasn't the first time she'd been criticized for still playing with toys at the age of 9, she didn't understand what the harm was. It didn't mean she was immature. If anything, she was very well behaved compared to most her age.
Tell you what, I'll give it back, after I have a little fun with it,
he said with a smirk. Ib did not like the sound of that, as he placed one hand on top of the toy's head with the other on its torso, giving it a slight tug. The very thought of what he was going to do next made Ib feel increasingly anxious, sending her heart pounding at an accelerated pace.
You see, kid, I take any opportunity I get to grab whatever I want. And when I do, I like to make improvements.
Now she knew for certain what he was planning.
No!
Ib cried.
You want it so badly? Come get it.
With a sudden yank, the plush toy was torn in two, its stuffing quickly descending to the ground, followed by its head and torso. Such a terrible sight made Ib fall to her knees in shock. Time seemed to stand still as she stared at the pieces of her beloved toy. Before she knew it, she felt a stream of tears sliding down her cheeks as she started sobbing quietly. The teen's laughter at the sight of her misery was audible, and she could tell this very much amused him. Why he decided to act so cruelly toward her was beyond her understanding. To Ib, this wasn't just any stuffed toy. It meant so much more to her. For as many bunnies as she owned, gifted mainly by her father, she treated them with the same level of care as if they were her real friends, even giving each of them a name. Throughout her young life, she struggled to form bonds with other kids, so those stuffed friends of hers were all that she had to fill that emptiness. And now she sat in utter despair at the sight of one of them destroyed. As she continued crying, the laughter came to an abrupt stop. A familiar voice called out her name, followed by footsteps charging in her direction and the teen's aggravated shouts. Blinking through her teary vision, she could make out a figure wearing a dark blue coat as he confronted the person she presumed to be the same one who destroyed her doll. The angry exchanges between them rang in her ears, escalating from verbal conflict to a full-on fight within moments. Wiping her tears away, she saw that her suspicions were correct.
Garry!
Garry glanced down at her, only to be struck in the face by his opponent's fist, sending him back a few steps. He barely had a moment to react before he was met with a second punch to his stomach. The vicious blow forced Garry to his knees, gasping for breath. As he sat there clutching his abdomen, Garry's head was yanked up by his hair, and as a final assault, he felt a knee smash into his face from his attacker. Ib watched in horror as her friend helplessly lay there, writhing in agony. She desperately wanted to help him, but her fears prevented her from moving even a single muscle. The enraged teen made a sudden turn to face her, rage visible in his eyes.
You knew he'd come, didn't you?
He snarled. Ib shook her head frantically.
No, I didn't.
Liar!
He spat.
Looks like you need to be taught a lesson too.
He began to advance towards Ib, his intent clear in his eyes. Ib instinctively took a few steps back as he drew nearer, only to trip over a stray root. In an instant, his hand clamped onto her collar, hoisting her from the ground and pinning her against a tree, causing her to yelp. Ib's eyes widened as she found herself face to face with him. While she didn't dare speak, her eyes begged him for mercy, but she could see nothing but the desire to harm her. Now that they were isolated from others, she knew that nobody would come to her rescue. As she closed her eyes tightly and turned her head away to brace herself for the inevitable pain, she suddenly felt the man's hold on her quickly release, making her land hard on the ground. When she opened her eyes, she saw Garry grappling with her attacker as he promptly pushed him flat on his back. Instantly, Garry's fist connected with his face. He clearly hit the teen pretty hard as he cried out in pain, but was soon cut off as Garry delivered another strike to him. The next thing Ib knew, Garry's fists were a blur as he mercilessly pounded the man's face. She sat there in shock and disbelief as she watched him. She had seen him angry before, but this wasn't like him at all. For once, she felt frightened of Garry, the same person who had always seemed so kind and gentle. It made her question for a moment if this were the same person she had grown close to in the few months they'd known each other.
Garry...
Ib said faintly. Garry showed no sign of stopping. With each blow he landed, his fists grew increasingly stained with red, and Ib dreaded the thought of what might happen if she let this go on. Even if it was all out of a desire to protect her, the man seemed to have given up attempting to shield himself as Garry continued to pummel him. She knew she had to intervene somehow. Taking a deep breath, she managed to muster enough strength to shout,
Garry, stop!
Garry turned to Ib as he was about to raise his fist once more. Seeing how distressed she was, he snapped back to reality and slowly lowered his arm. As he sat over the young man, panting, he saw the amount of damage he had done to his face and felt somewhat regretful for his actions. With a sigh, he grabbed him by his shirt and glared directly at him.
If I ever see you near Ib again, you'll be sorry,
he said, shoving the man back to the ground and proceeding to get up. Not a second later, the teen quickly got to his feet and staggered off. All the while, Garry stood there and watched, making sure that monster was as far away from them as possible. Once he could no longer see him, he turned to Ib. She was still a bit shaken up by his actions from earlier, making him feel worse than he already did.
I'm sorry you had to see me like that. I was just so worried about him hurting you, I just lost it,
he said, feeling too ashamed to look at her. Ib's expression softened. Despite how he had acted out earlier, she couldn't blame him entirely for it. She knew how protective he could be sometimes. However, part of her wondered if he had been in conflicts like this before, but she didn't dare ask as it wasn't her business to know. Looking at the crimson droplets slowly trickling down from Garry's nose, Ib felt an immediate rush of guilt. Realizing all of this was because of her absent-mindedness. She had always been taught by her mother to take care of her things, and now, the one time she forgets, she and her friend were put in danger.
It's my fault,
she muttered. This took Garry aback.
What? Ib, you didn't...
I got distracted and left Mirabelle behind, and he took her.
She interrupted, tears growing in her eyes once more.
I'm sorry, Garry.
Garry knelt down and placed a hand on her shoulder.
Hey, don't be too hard on yourself. I know you didn't mean for this to happen.
He lifted her head by her chin to face her.
Look, you just gotta keep an eye on your stuff next time, okay?
Ib nodded and brushed her tears away, followed by a hug from Garry, hoping to put her at ease. Once Ib had finally relaxed, Garry stood up and picked up the two halves of her doll.
I think I can sew her back up,
he said as he examined it closely.
Really?
Ib asked as her eyes lit up.
Yeah, I think I have enough thread to do so, and I'll be sure to give her back once she's fixed.
Hearing that gave her a sense of comfort. Provided Garry had fulfilled his promise to return her handkerchief a few months before, she was confident he'd also go through with this.
For now, why don't we grab some macarons?
Garry said with a smile and wrapped an arm around Ib.
You've had a rough day. You deserve something nice.